Great. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everyone. Sorry I can't be there today. I'm presenting this study on behalf of Anusha and myself. Really, she did all the hard work, and if you like it, it's all thanks to her. It's part of a bigger project she was doing, looking at security fatigue factors influencing risk tolerance among data specialists. So today we're just focusing on the security fatigue part. Now, it's not a mistake. I recently listened to two nice presentations, which started with a conclusion. And it's sort of just to give you an indication of where this is headed. And if you don't like where this is headed, now's a good time to go and grab a coffee. And you get a bonus 25 minutes break. And then we'll tell the story of how we get to this conclusion for the rest of the presentation. So in essence, what we're saying, and what I think everyone at this conference knows and has been saying, is that security behavior is a multifaceted and complex thing. And what we are arguing in this paper is just that fatigue is something we should all be thinking about as well. We can add a lot of things that employees need to do, but having a focus on fatigue is very important. We've identified several themes that contribute to this phenomenon, in our opinion. And if I could summarize them in one sentence, here it is. So in our specific case study, despite having an awareness of risks to sensitive information, employees can face challenges such as a compliance effort, increased stress, resigned frustration, so all these feelings and emotions, as well as doubts as to the adequacy of their security knowledge. And we'll look at a few quotes and examples of how these things occur. And we think it's important to take note of these factors because they can give us more insight into the context within which employees operate, and also give us these opportunities to improve our human-centered security. Right, so having said all that, let's start the sort of paper properly now on the journey. And the first thing I think we all know is that employees are often seen as barriers, but also facilitators of information security. The big problem we deal with is how to create a security-minded workforce, and that remains a persistent challenge. Very commonly, we put in place policies and procedures as our sort of primary security effort, but these can often have a negative impact on employees. So as this first bullet point illustrates, when we're faced with this array of complex security requirements, these are often difficult to understand as well as to satisfy in many organizations. Now, I've just put up on the right-hand side here our university's security policies. I had to zoom so far out to get them all on one screen here, so I'm not sure how readable they are anymore, but there is actually quite a lot expected of a university employee here. Most notably, a new BYOD policy, which is a really interesting exercise to go through. And I can say that I consider myself to be quite sort of pro-security, easily sort of compliant, and I can start to feel the fatigue of all these 2FA logins, getting the app open on your phone all the time to log in, having to install extra things on devices to make them compliant with policies. So it is definitely an emotion one could recognize in many situations. And so the security-related workload and cognitive demand may lead to increased psychological stress, exhaustion, and eventually security fatigue. So researchers have identified that fatigue can lead employees to perform a constant sort of cost-benefit calculation, trying to determine sort of what's an acceptable level of risk they can take to still achieve their work goals, which is normally the important things for employees. And what researchers have identified is what they term this vicious circle, where, for example, we introduce some security policies and procedures. These create a burden on employees and they experience fatigue, which then leads to more risky behavior. And when the organization notices this, they in turn start to strengthen their checking for this behavior and adding more rules to prevent these from happening. So these additional policies and procedures get added, but this just leads to more employee fatigue and the cycle repeating again. So it is important to be aware of the fact that fatigue has this effect on people. So what we wanted to do in our study was explore how security fatigue manifests and affects employees with increased responsibility for sensitive information. Some employees definitely have this as a very specific job role, and our focus was on these. We termed them data specialists, also called various similar things like data analysts in various places. But their main purpose would be to transform raw data into information. And we sort of state that understanding these factors could assist organizations in creating perhaps more employee-friendly policies and procedures, or choosing appropriate technical security solutions, or helping to tailor security education, training, and awareness activities. Now, I feel slightly underqualified to even talk about this slide here, since all the authors mentioned are actually listening, but I'll just stand still briefly talking about security fatigue. So Steve's definition here says that security fatigue, the term security fatigue recognizes the situation in which users of systems and staff in organizations can tire of dealing with security or encountering messages and warnings in relation to it. And although fatigue cannot be empirically measured, it may be expressed through several factors, such as the three mentioned here: effort, difficulty, and importance. So here, effort is described as the energy spent to achieve compliance. Difficulty describes the quantity of energy expended to provide that required effort. And importance is the priority assigned to the compliance task. And I've been reminded by reviewers that you shouldn't put this into a formula, but here is a formula nonetheless, which sort of just shows this trade-off that unless the task is really important to you, the effort and difficulty to achieve security is going to lead to fatigue. And this threshold that you get to, becoming weary and desensitized, where compliance becomes too difficult and burdensome, this is the point where security fatigue sets in. Now, the other bit of background I just want to briefly mention is talking a bit about data specialists. We all know that data management is a key component in information security. And in organizations today, there is a definite effort to comply with numerous data protection legislation. So there are very strict security protocols and processes in place in most organizations. And that responsibility may weigh heavily on specifically data specialists and increase the stress placed on those working with sensitive information. And we argue that security compliance is a complex phenomenon, and one of the components is the lived experience of individuals in the organizations. And it's important to identify these viewpoints by subgroups like data specialists to understand the impact security has on them. So our approach is based on the fact that we're trying to explore the human experience in the study. And so we adopted an interpretivist paradigm and performed a case study. We collected data from 12 participants using semi-structured interviews. And to identify these participants, we used a purposive sampling technique, so that we had participants who were data specialists. They were dealing with sensitive information in their day-to-day roles. and they had this propensity to experience security fatigue. So just to add a bit more detail, participants in the study represented both technical and business roles. Job titles were things such as a database administrator, IT managers, analysts, BI developers, data engineers, business analysts, BI managers. There were 9 males and 3 females, and they all had extensive experience in mid to senior specialist roles. And we then used thematic analysis following the 6-step approach recommended by Braun and Clark, which allowed us to analyze the data and discover themes and patterns in the data. Prior to that analysis, the recorded interviews were transcribed and captured in vivo, which is a computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, and care was taken to ensure the data was fully anonymized and appropriately stored for the analysis. The HAISA organization was a large financial services company based in South Africa, which also has a footprint in the rest of Africa. And leveraging information as an asset had recently gained in strategic importance for the organization. And they appointed a core team of dedicated specialists to support that data function. And here you see some of the key positions that were established. More or less the same time, another significant appointment was the first Chief Information Security Officer, sort of dedicated to this role. And alongside that appointment, the information security community in the organization had grown, focusing efforts on ensuring information security compliance. And so we saw this organization as highly relevant as they were processing large volumes of sensitive information, as well as implementing these strict security protocols that could lead to employee security fatigue. So jumping into the analysis and the themes identified, there were 4 themes that we present in the paper. And the first one was awareness of risks to sensitive information. So all these data specialists were very comfortable in managing information and in dealing with the sensitive nature of that data when it was their sole responsibility. But what could be observed was that there was a level of unease when they were tasked to share information with other parties. So when it was not just them alone who were responsible. So while that task of managing information was routine to the participants, that increased security consciousness in the organization had left participants fearful and unsure whether security processes are sufficiently followed, especially by external parties. Participants really valued security and wanted to do the right thing, but perceived a lack of clear guidance, standards, and tools, which then increased their security fatigue. Another factor was a growing concern about data breaches. As these 2 quotes illustrate, they knew the value of the data, and this heightened their sensitivity and their responsibility they felt towards ensuring the security of that information. And that in turn also led them to feel like they needed to create extra awareness within their own team, as they were these custodians sitting with most of the data in the organization, which really added to the burden of protecting this information for them. A second theme we identified was the influence of their compliance effort with security requirements. So we all get told compliance is a choice, and organizational security goals are secondary when employees' primary focus is on the delivery of their day-to-day tasks and responsibilities. So in this participant group of data specialists who had the responsibility to manage information assets in the organization, the effort required to comply with security requirements was becoming unmanageable. So a lot of their activities were driven by the need to complete their primary work goals, and they were often willing to forego some security requirements to do that. So they were inadvertently worn down by the energy spent in this constant cost-benefit analysis, as literature refers to it. So we can see that they were fully aware of the need for compliance, but they were using these bypasses to still fulfill their main job when security was becoming too burdensome. A specific example was password management, where a lot of passwords were required to protect data. And we all know the problems with passwords. So because there was not sufficient technical support for them, a lot of the things we identify as bad practice, such as repeating passwords, keeping them to a minimum length, and even writing some of them down, was happening in the organization as a way to reduce this cognitive overload. So overall, there was a strong preference among the participants for security solutions which would reduce the effort on their part. And this is something important to note for organizations. A third theme was the influence of psychological stress. So the organization had elevated security as one of its highest priorities, but in doing so created a sense of panic and fear of getting into trouble if the compliance wasn't there. And employees displayed a lot of increased anxiety. So as literature often reports, employees are overwhelmed with security requirements and are often not allowed to assimilate these highly complex processes into their frame of reference and work routines. There wasn't any clear guidelines from notable authorities, for example, within this organization on how employees should deal with security-related matters in the face of all this effort required on their part. And a lot of the employees presented this feeling of wanting to give up. So there was this sense of resignation with all the effort that would be required. And it was felt that security was being enforced with a dictatorial approach. There were some factors which contributed to this. For example, older employees especially showed such emotions, as well as those who had experienced a security incident before. But the one positive aspect was that despite this frustration with the strict protocols in place, employees understood that the process was important and there to mitigate risk. And in general, there was a willingness to comply, even though it was difficult at times. And the final theme we noted was feelings around the adequacy of knowledge. So since the appointment of the CISO, the organization had radically increased security awareness drives. There were a lot of campaigns happening all the time, and participants claimed to be overwhelmed with the frequency and the duration of these activities. So one example that was given was phishing exercises, trying to identify weaknesses in the organization. Often the time to complete these activities could be up to 6 hours every month, and there were strict deadlines and penalties in place if employees didn't pass the awareness tests. So there was often online training material that employees needed to look at, and then questionnaires to complete afterwards. And there was this question of whether this is just an academic exercise, whether it was just ticking the boxes. So when the organizational security awareness activities do not have this desired effect, we see that employees are not empowered with the necessary skills to perform their security sort of enhanced tasks. And gaining compliance through awareness activities demand a lot of effort and skill, but it left the participants despondent with no desire to comply. An additional thing we noticed was that as the organization adopted new technologies, for example, cloud storage, this challenged the employees to willfully increase their level of knowledge to avert security incidents. And again, it required considerable effort, which led to security fatigue. So finally, we highlight in this study the need to understand how security fatigue plays a role in the cycle of security compliance and in harmonizing risk. And through some of these examples, show factors which play a role. So while it's not easy to recognize security fatigue, we have identified several themes that contribute to this phenomena. And despite some of these themes probably seeming quite straightforward and not being that novel, we think that a contribution here is that we can identify behavioral characteristics within these concepts or patterns of use, especially in these groups of employees. And that could be helpful to understand how security fatigue manifests and create a plan which we can then use to deal with that. So I thank you for listening, and here's contact details in case there's any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Al. I'm going to ask the audience here, the face-to-face audience, if there are any questions from you regarding security